I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance here to respond to the other panelists and to what they've heard on the stage today, and also throw out there one question that you might consider in your responses as well, which is not only on this panel, but in the last 2 days, I think we've heard from a lot of different presenters that may be seen as working more within or outside the current system, and that's the strategies they've chosen. And I want to ask you to help us think through how we might work together, or at least in concert, despite the fact that we have different strategies or different ideas about how we get where we're going. Because I know you guys don't have any problem, respecting one another and talking through these things, but I at least perceive often in this country a real reluctance for those kind of perceived groups to talk to one another and to figure out how we get there together, and a real insistence on, my strategy is the strategy, so when you're ready to come over to me, we can rock. Yeah, that's my challenge for you in these responses, but also please feel free to respond to anything else that you heard on the panel today. So I'll give each of you guys a little bit of time, and then we'll turn it over to you.
So I think that the challenge of working together across differences in strategy has been one of the most difficult challenges that I've had to deal with in the 25, 30 years that I've been at this work. It becomes particularly difficult, I think, in contexts in which the structure of the battles that we're fighting puts us against one another, right? So for me, we have a former co-chair of the Green Party of the United States. We have, a vice chair of the state Democratic Party, largest Democratic Party in the country, aside from the National. I wish National was more like the state, and maybe it will be. But I'll just highlight that divide. In election years, it oftentimes becomes very difficult within political parties and across political parties for people who put the movement first to continue to do that. So what I'll just say is, I think we need to keep our eyes on the prize, that electoral politics, as has been said, I think earlier in this teach-in, needs to serve movement building, not the other way around. And when there are difficulties around doing that, we need to respect that there will be differences around those questions and choose, if we're going to fight electorally, to fight with those who are most on the other side rather than with our allies. So just to give you an example, I am from Wisconsin too. I grew up in Madison most of my life. The Greens in Wisconsin never ran against Russ Feingold. We never ran against Tammy Baldwin. We never ran against Mark Pocan, who I'm proud to say is the congressman from the 2nd Congressional District now. However, we did run against Jim Doyle, who was the governor who signed the preemption legislation that stopped the first wave of municipal minimum wage ordinances, which Greens in Madison and Milwaukee and other cities who were on the city council led on, right? So we have to pick our battles, right? And that needs to happen in other arenas too. So I'll just leave that question there. The other thing I want to address is something that came up in both Jaraka and Jen's remarks, which was about the tension between long-term strategies and short-term immediate realities. And it is something that, for those of us who have been working at building an explicit democracy movement in the United States, we've been grappling with this for many years. And so I've come up with a couple things I just want to share. One is that while demands for justice and demands for democracy can come into conflict, they can also be mutually reinforcing. And when you challenge power, you challenge those in power, that becomes the thing that they most want to protect. And they will give you wins on the immediate day-to-day demands. So when we won divestment from Burma at the University of Wisconsin, it was because we challenged the authority of the Board of Regents to govern. We went after them personally. We got legislation introduced to make them an elected body, right? They cave in on investment. When we got a tuition freeze, the first tuition freeze in university history, it was for the same reason, right? And I could point to many other examples of where that's the case. So we have to figure out the ways in which demands for power can interact with demands for justice, for doing the right thing in the here and now in a positive way rather than in a negative way. I have more to say, but I'll stop so that we can have other voices here.
I'm going to think about the premise that our electoral system is not yet a democratic space. And our political parties certainly are not democratic spaces. And in many instances, our big institutions and community organizations and labor are not democratic spaces. So one way that we can begin the process is we can start by democratizing the spaces we are already in. You know, the Fight for 15 is near and dear to my heart. And you'll notice that there's a labor endorsement for Hillary. There is no Fight for 15 endorsement, right? And if many of you were here for the earlier comments that, you know, Hillary was nowhere to be found in Seattle, though she claims credit for it, there's a reason for that. You know, I sit on the board of the Working Families Party, and part of the reason to have the Working Families Party is because, yes, we want to align labor and community when it advances our causes for justice, and yet there are things that we can do as an aligned party that labor in and of itself cannot do. I think the other thing that I would think about is, where do we start? For a lot of people, they're starting their engagement in this political process at the top with Bernie Sanders, right? We see literally all of us probably have at least 10 friends who never messed with politics before, who all of a sudden is going to rallies and making phone calls and doing all kinds of incredible organizing work, right? Oftentimes we start at the top, and my philosophy, and thank God the philosophy of the foundation I now work for, is that all change happens from the bottom up. And so what would it look like if we went to majority people of color cities and those cities began to collectively organize for the liberation of folks of color, right? They took over their city governments and their school boards and other democratic institutions, and they did it with a frame of liberation. How would that change the scope of our national politics, right? What if we all showed up to these meetings, the Republican Party meetings and the Democratic Party meetings that we claim we want to have a voice in, instead of bashing them on Facebook? How does that change what actually happens at those top levels? And I think one last thing that I'll say, and you know, folks may respond to this, is, you know, white folks, y'all got some work to do. And it's not in communities of color. I think that what we've seen with Black Lives Matter is that when we let Black folks lead, when we center Black liberation, when we empower Black women to take our rightful places in leadership positions, that we are able to really move and accomplish and advance an incredible agenda, right? The question is, who's talking to other white folks? You know, I come from Wisconsin, and yeah, we got Milwaukee and Madison, but we got a whole lot of rural communities. And nobody's talking to them, right? So we need white folks to lead in white communities for liberation if we want to truly have a democratic society.
There's a lot of really great stuff has just been said, really thoughtful things. I guess overall my approach at this point in my activist career or whatever is I just feel like the question of inside and outside is overdetermined, to use a sort of academic term. And in other words, like we think it's a much bigger deal, this distinction, than it actually is. Like I don't have any problem with, and I've never had any problem with, like, on the same day being at a county Democratic Party meeting and talking about who our endorsement should be and how we should organize and so forth, and then going to an Occupy rally. Like, I didn't have to go through a big ideological torment to be able to do both of those things in one day, let alone in one lifetime or one sort of activist portfolio. So I feel like we make that a sort of bigger lifestyle choice, I guess, than it need be. That's the first thing. Where I do think people have been very clever, very smart, everybody on this panel, is that there are actually other dilemmas that are perhaps more salient and that are not, and that apply to everybody no matter what our project is. And that's like, as was put, this question of long-term versus short-term thinking. Like, everybody has that dilemma. That's a difficult thing. In party politics or electoral politics, you could talk about it as how much energy do we put into just like making sure this fascist Republican doesn't get elected to this office, and how much are we sort of like building for the next 10 elections and thinking about changing the debate or putting more people into the pipeline, et cetera. Those are difficult, regardless of where you come down on the Democratic Party question. Like, those are difficult dilemmas. And I don't have a quick fix. What I like is that, what I wish for progressives is that we would be more deliberative and thoughtful about those questions rather than keep continuing to hash out this like century-old debate about what sort of formal role different parties play in different states, et cetera. That's my first thought. My second thought is this, more specifically, looking at the Fight for 15 movement and a demand and a sort of critique, that's very interesting is how who's in the room makes a really big difference. So the Fight for 15 starts as a movement, a demand, a critique from workers, from unions that are trying to figure out how to gain some purchase in the fast food industry and the service industry. So they make this demand: everybody should make $15 an hour and have a right to collectively bargain. Fantastic. Right? And then you could sort of do a case study of sort of a tale of two states in terms of how this played out. In New York, this notion is sort of taken up by different, sort of elite forces, powerful forces in New York politics, and it's hashed out and it's fought about, and the end result is, a $15 minimum wage for part of the city, sometimes for certain people, or part of the state, and like half of the state is completely left out. In California, there's also a it's qualified for the ballot in two different forms. There's a movement to put it on the ballot in a bunch of cities and counties and different agencies. The labor movement and the grassroots movement allied to it around Fight for 15 are very much in the room for the negotiations. It's a very different kind of political party in California, or Democratic Party in California, than it is in New York. And so the policy outcome is different, and it has far fewer exemptions, it kicks in faster, and it applies to everybody in the state. That to me is a lesson that I guess is that I don't think that progressives and people that are movement oriented and that want big systemic change should think that there's some division of labor in which there's some sellout centrist Democrats will be in the room to make that happen. We don't have to be in that room. No, you got to be in the room. You have to follow it all the way through. You have to be part of the implementation, part of the hashing out, part of the whole process. And that necessarily means getting over a phobia of being inside.
Yeah, I guess some of the things that are on my mind are, I feel like we have a lot of different tastes of liberation. I think that Beyonce offers a glimpse of liberation. Bernie offers a glimpse of liberations. And then at the same time, there are so many complications within those structures, within the structure of, in many ways, sort of the most sophisticated form of entertainment and the most sophisticated form of party politics. And but is the glimpse enough to help us be transitional in turning a corner toward real liberation, or is the glimpse just something to satisfy folks enough to actually not participate? And that's where I think the control and ownership over culture plays, it can be leveraged and weighted there. Because it is in the air, like a lot of systems change, revolutionary thinking is in the air. People are interacting with it every day, and I think there's a real fight to control and contain it, from Bernie to Beyonce, and that is, and I also don't think that we're in that room. We're not in the room producing it. I think that Bernie and Beyonce will take bits of movement and incorporate it into their situation. But at the end of the day, our role with Beyonce is to consume. Yep. And our role with Bernie is to, vote. And that's very limiting. And I think there isn't the recognition that there wouldn't be lemonade without folks every day struggling through the lemons to make it for, you know, and I would even argue that like folks didn't make that lemonade for Beyonce. And folks didn't make an idea of a political revolution for Bernie. And so where are we in that room? Like how do we fight that battle? Because like imagine if the next massive cultural moment, like I would say a Ferguson, you know, the Ferguson was a cultural phenomenal moment that was based on rebellion, on open rebellion, on people saying, I am ready to die for this, which is why I'm ready to live for this.
Yes.
And it was 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, black youth who had that sophisticated enough analysis and heart and commitment, imagination to understand liberation, understand ownership, understand community. And I'll never forget marching with thousands of people at 2 a.m. when we took over the university there, the entire university. It was thousands of people. It was many different marches that somehow came together. And the head sort of peacekeeper at 2 a.m. was a young black woman, teenager, and on her shirt was just reckless. And it was the most organized, one of the most powerful events I've ever been to. That it all snaked in. We took over the entire university in St. Louis for hours and hours and hours. And then the first speaker got up and said, "We're here to destroy white supremacy. Are you here for that?" And we're like, "Yeah." So I think it's that type of clarity and revolutionary thinking that then gets taken by folks, you know the difference between jazz and ragtime? You know, like some people play jazz, and I would say Ferguson was playing jazz. And ragtime, you take 8 bars of some good jazz and you just repeat it over and over again. And the trick is that most people can't tell the difference between jazz and ragtime. But if we're able to do that, then I think we can turn the corner around systemic systems change. Beyonce is kind of playing ragtime, sorry.
This is fantastic stuff, and I know there's so much more could be said, but time is against us as always. I want to turn it over to you guys. I want to take 2 or 3 questions at once, and then just use the remaining time to let these guys answer any and all of those as they can. And you guys all look wonderful, but I'm wondering if there are any questions from folks who are not self-identified as white men. I'll just give 1 second, one call there first. If not, I expect you to come up and ask your question afterwards, because I know you have questions. All right?
Are you guys coming to the consensus that it doesn't really matter who's president? Do you think if Bernie is president, he's going to make some systematic change to this country?
It absolutely matters who's president.
Thank you.
But it's not the end-all be-all. And in particular, for black communities across this country, we have been poor and oppressed under Democrats and under Republicans, right? So, you know, yes, it matters. There are certain candidates who will be substantially better than others, and I am in the camp that says Hillary Clinton will be substantially better than Donald Trump, right? At the same time, I think for my communities, the communities that, you know, of South LA, right, who are desperate for political representation, that truly holds their lives as valuable. You know, I would say that what matters more to them is who's elected in local office. What matters more to those communities is, do they have control over the resources that flow through South LA? The number of oil fields, we have a report, right, that you all can pick up called Drilling Down, that highlights the expansion of oil drilling in South and East LA. That's capital. That's resources that not only do not drill down into those communities, right, that they have no benefit from, but instead it's creating massive harm, right, and health impacts on them. So the president won't fix what's happening in South LA, but because of a lot of activism and because our organization's model has changed, not charity, we didn't give folks money to go to the doctor, we gave folks money to build power. And a couple of weeks ago, they passed a historic buffer zone law called Clean Up, Green Up that will dramatically reduce the amount of oil drilling in those communities. So that's what I think matters the most in terms of systems change, is getting to the root of the system, not the face of the system.
I guess I'd quickly say is that I'm as concerned about where we'll be after the election than where the candidates will be. And going back, okay, Beyonce does play a little jazz, but I'm interested in also interested in where will the Bayhive be? Yeah. Where will the Bernie Bros be? If that's a real thing, I don't actually know. But where will we be after the election happens? Because right now it's really unclear. Is the energy going to go away? And where will it? Like how powerful will we be? What will our levers be?
I've agreed with everything I've heard so far. I think it matters a lot, but there's limitations to how much it matters. And there's we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. All of those sort of cliches that come out. I just want to take a second though and recognize that. I totally agree. We need to think about where we're going to be, and that's very important. But this Bernie Sanders thing is pretty freaking amazing. It's a pretty amazing thing, and it's allowing a kind of set of conversations about the relationship between people's everyday lives and big picture and big questions that I've certainly in all of my political career never been able to do in a way that's also being followed by the mainstream press. I mean, turning on a Democratic candidates debate and hearing that level of real critique and accountability about what's been going on in this country for the past several decades is a remarkable thing, and I think that the Sanders campaign should be credited for that. Yes, we need to be looking ahead. Yes, we've got to be hard-nosed and pragmatic, and the struggle continues and so forth. All of that, I agree, 100%. But I do think it's okay, just like it was okay for us to take a second and have a breath and be like, oh my God, America just elected Barack Hussein Obama. That's a big fucking deal. I think that we can also have some breathtaking and some, taking a moment to recognize what a really big deal the Sanders campaign is.
I think, I'll just say in response to that, in response to the Sanders campaign, I do feel like the thing that I have learned more than anything else about that campaign is the importance of us pooling and connecting our money together. Joining philanthropy, what I learned is that rich people are very organized about how they spend their money and how they utilize their resources together to accomplish their goals. And I think as working class folks, right, we have some ways that some institutions where we can do that, like labor unions, right? The power of labor unions is not just in how many members, because lots of organizations have millions of members, right? The Democratic Party in Wisconsin, only has 5,000 members, but 1.4 million people who vote on the Democratic line item, right? So what I think about when I think about Bernie is, goddamn, if we raised $47 million every single month because we were all putting in $5 or $10, what could we do? How could that change our communities? How could we have a collective way to care for each other that is outside of, the systems that were given to us? Right. And so I think that to me is a lesson that we all can take, and that absolutely, right, the ownership of our capital and the collaboration amongst our capital is absolutely a foundation for our next system.
What's that?
Oh, you just got 4 minutes.
You got it. So I'll try to keep this brief. I'm not here as a Green, so I'm not going to make the arguments about why investing in a Green presidential campaign are worthwhile, aside to point out that it is true that after strong Green presidential campaigns, there are many people who are elected to office as Greens, and local elections where they are the leaders on municipal minimum wage ordinances or sanctuary cities movement or resisting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'll leave that there. What I do want to sort of emphasize is that it's something that may be controversial, but there are at least a couple witnesses in this room. I predicted last year that Bernie Sanders would get about 40% of the popular vote in about 17 states. So I'm not actually surprised by what has happened with the Sanders campaign. I think it's positive. I agree with that. I think that some of the things he said in debates are positive and have opened up space. But I actually see it as the outgrowth of the movement building that we've all been a part of for many years. After Black Lives Matter, after the Dreamers, after Wisconsin, after Occupy, why should we be surprised that we have mainstreamed radical politics? So the power comes from that organizing. And yes, it does matter who's elected to office, but that's for another day.
One more, I think it's all we got time for.
I guess we don't have that much time left. My question is also pertaining to the Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party. I am a Norwegian American socialist with anarchist values, and I have been supporting and working for Bernie Sanders since May. Not because I think it's the sole struggle I should be involved in, because I see it as an important part of what's going on right now. And anyway, I guess the question I kind of wanted to ask you guys to speak to is to what extent can our electoral politics be a site of struggle? Because I think the campaign is making it clear that they're taking it all the way to the convention. It's going to be really interesting to see what kind of arguments that campaign is going to make to distinguish themselves from Hillary Clinton. And I actually just found out this morning I'm going to have the privilege of producing some videos for the campaign. And I'm really interested to see whether they're going to be at all kind of taking up this language of democratizing what the Democratic Party does, bottom up, like that kind of bottom up language. And I'm curious, do you think that's feasible? Do you see that happening? We don't have a lot of time, but thank you.
Yeah, I guess I come back to with all candidates is how much of it do we own or can we own? You know, where is the real ownership there? And I think it is actually an opportunity to challenge, to pressure test this with a campaign like the Sanders campaign. Is that, will there be will it really do things differently? You know, is it going to come into this realm of imagination and jazz, or will it just be very good ragtime or more sophisticated ragtime? And I think that's going to be the decision that it sounds like the campaign has to make soon. Between now and the convention, what are they going to do with all that resource? What are they going to do with all that energy? And will it be able to be owned and controlled by the movement that created it or not? And I think that that's going to be a really tough question for the campaign. Yeah, and I think there's also a really key difference with Bernie and Obama is that it is in terms of race, in terms of racial relevance, racial consciousness, and how it touched a coalition of people of color, black leadership, and progressives. In the Obama example, with the Sanders example, it hasn't figured out that actual rainbow coalition that I think would lead to more power ownership in the long run.
Phenomenal. So before I ask you to join me in thanking these guys, I just want to encourage you to keep asking questions. Ask them of yourself. Ask them of each other, ask them of these guys, ask them of the folks you haven't yet met in the room. That sometimes the questions are as provocative as the answers, and sometimes they help us figure out, what's right for us, and they bring us to the next one of these meetings, teach-ins, conventions that help us continue to figure out how we fight together, or at least side by side or in concert with one another and one another's movements, so that we get where we all know we need to go. So thank you for being here, thank you for participating, and help me thank these guys for a fantastic panel.